Last week we went over to that's a long walk. It was about 5 minutes, 6 minutes. 6. Monty was leaving, so 6. Everybody know the history. Yeah, I know it. Yeah, Bruce told me. Sometime on the road there, Bruce gave me the story.
I see that. There's no napkins in the men's room, by the way. You want to?
I want to thank you all for coming. I'm Babette Huber, the Village and Town Historian. This is our historic lecture series, and next month's will be about Ganondagan. The president, Kathy White, will be here. Yes. Oh, it's going to be at Valentine. Topic is Valentine and the Grange, right. So now I am going to introduce to you Michael Galban. He's the historic site manager and curator. Mm-hmm. Double whammy there, Michael, of the Seneca Art and Cultural Center. And you all know that Ganondagan is a 17th century Seneca town site and is nationally regarded as the center for Iroquoian history and cultural and environmental preservation. Mike's current research focuses on historic woodland arts, indigenous colonial history, and lectures on the subject, and he does lecture on the subjects extensively. He sits on the board of directors, still at the Museum Association of New York, and the editorial board of the New York History Journal. And he has worked on the Indigenous Working Group component of the Revolutionary War 250th New York Commission. He recently curated, no Shoney?
Yes.
Is that how you say it?
Yes.
Women from the time of creation at the Seneca Art and Cultural Center. I cannot read Seneca. Michael is currently researching moose hair false embroidery of the Northeast as part of his PhD work at the University of Rochester's Visual and Cultural Studies program. And he also collaborated, which was an awesome thing last year. If you didn't get up to the museum to see the wampum exhibit, he collaborated with the Musée du Quai Branly. Close?
It's good enough for American French.
And it was on exhibit last year. Mm-hmm. So I want to welcome Michael Galban to talk to us about Ganondagan past, present, and future.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Babette, for that kind introduction. So, just I'll give you a quick background to myself. I'm not a native New Yorker. I was born in California, Southern California. I'm a Northern Paiute. We're the southernmost Northern Paiute, if that makes any sense, and a Washoe. And my people come from the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains. But I've lived in the Rochester area since we last moved here in 1984. And of that time, I've worked at Ganondagan since 1991. So that puts me in 33 years of being here in the Victor area, working and living in Farmington with my lovely wife and 3 kids. So I became the historic site manager around 3 years ago when Peter Jemison retired. I had been managing the site. Peter had some health issues prior to that, so I had some kind of on-the-ground experience already, how to manage the site in terms of, budgetary and employee salary, all that kind of sort of logistical stuff. But now the burden of taking care of the site is fully on my shoulders, and I'm doing okay, doing great. We've had a great exhibition, an international exhibition, which has never occurred before within the New York State Park system. That's statewide. They've never attempted anything like what we did at Ganondagan. So there's some great successes. And our staff is doing a tremendous job of interpreting and planning too. So I've been here a while. Back when this was mostly farms 30 years ago, seemed like we're out by Ganondagan. And I have a long history and a love of the community and love of the town. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the earliest times when people were here first, and talk to you a little bit about the community of Ganondagan too. So all over our area in Ontario County, actually every county in New York State, if you ever wander in the woods or if you walk behind a plow after a rain, you're going to find evidence of humans here. And it might come in the form of an artifact like an arrowhead, a projectile point, a knife, pieces of pottery maybe. Hardly a week or two goes by when somebody doesn't stop up and show me something that their grandfather plowed up or their great uncle or someone had in this county and wanted to know about it and wanted to hear maybe a little bit more about it, what is the history behind these things. And to them, it's a very special connection, right? Because as the most recent inhabitants of the land here, to have a connection to the earliest inhabitants to the land, I think is a profound relationship. And it really comes from that moment when you pick up something off the ground and it's evidence of the long history of people in this area. And to be honest, I do my best at kind of sharing the history of those objects, but we don't accept them, actually. We don't take them into the museum. And do you know why we don't accept them? Anybody want to guess? I'm sorry? If they came from the property of Ganondagan, then I might be more apt to actually accept it. But if it just came from Ontario County or an adjacent county, I probably won't take it. And it's not because we don't have space. We could probably store them. But we already have a giant collection of stone tools, thousands and thousands of them, and they came from Sheldon Fisher over in Fishers, New York. We got the majority of the we call it lithic collection from him. And honestly, the objects are not rare because they're everywhere. You could find them everywhere. And when I explained the long, history of the piece, something might be 5,000 years old, 7,000 years old or more. Think about that vast amount of time. It's hard to imagine, right? When you can walk in any hedgerow around this county and pick up shotgun shells, that are discarded. You can even find the old brass tips when they used to be made out of cardboard. You could find them everywhere. They're all over the place. And they've only been using those for like a century and a half. Can you imagine, millennia? Well, hunters have been all over this land. They've left arrowheads and knives everywhere, and you can imagine over the last 7,000 years how much stuff builds up. And it's everywhere, But what it does do is it speaks to the long history of people on the land. So those people who are making those tools, making those arrowheads or knives or even atlatl points, they are they are the ancestors of who would become Seneca people later. And this is an interesting subject, right? Archaeologists want to give names to people who produce certain tools, and they name them after the site where they find the objects, right? They might find a little cluster of these objects in one particular place. Maybe it's on somebody's farm, whatever, and they name the site after that, right? And then the people become known as those people, which is really interesting because we don't know their names or what they called themselves that long ago. So you find people who make Brewerton Brewerton arrowheads, right, lithics, from a Brewerton site, the Brewerton family that lived there and farmed there. Those people never called themselves Brewertons, So the question then is what did they call themselves, and when did Seneca people become Senecas, right? How did they emerge out of this vast history, which we don't really have a complete understanding of, but we know they were here. We can track their communities. You can tell where their towns were. They're smaller, much smaller than the 17th century towns. And so the way I explain it is on the south end of Canandaigua Lake, near to Bear Hill and South Hill, and that area where the West River kind of comes into the lake, right? That area is where Seneca people became Senecas. And this is, it comes from two different ways of thinking. One way of thinking is through an oral history, the story the Seneca people tell about themselves, that they emerged from Bear Hill and lived in that area. The second is archaeology, and Arthur Parker, the Seneca archaeologist and historian, who once worked in the New York State Museum and then in the Rochester Museum later, Rochester Municipal Museum. He kind of identified that culturally from the things the people made there as being Seneca. And so he said, this is probably where they came from, right? But what were they before that, right? They didn't just pop up out of thin air, right? So it's kind of hard for people to understand. And I use this analogy. It's pretty simple. So there was a point when Americans became Americans. There was a time, and actually a date. Do you know what that date is? When did Americans become Americans? Because they weren't always Americans. We celebrate it every... Yes, you got it. On July 4th, 1776 is when the United States declared independence from Great Britain. And at that point, they became themselves. They became a consortium of 13 colonies, independent. Declaring the independence meant that they were something else. And so that something else really evolves over time, but you could point to that moment when Americans became themselves. They confederated. They started to sort of create a system of law, system of governance. It was very different from being a subject of the king. And so, but, in June of 1776, they were still subjects, right? They were still subjects to the crown. So much in the same way, Seneca people became themselves culturally at some point on the south end of Canandaigua Lake. And they came out of a different time. So Seneca people, or we'll say indigenous people in the Northeast, experienced important moments in time that radically changed the way people lived. Like we're living in one right now that we're in the age of the internet, the age of the digital. This has transformed life for us, probably forever, right? But I think everyone here can remember when there wasn't one. And Sometimes people are sad about that, lament it. Some people are excited about the possibilities of the future, with an internet. However you see it, it definitely was a moment that we have lived through. And so Seneca people also lived through these moments that changed the way people live. And I'll share with you one of the biggest ones, actually. So, and it all corresponds and aligns with this time at the south end of Canandaigua Lake. And all these things are aligning with that moment. So, more or less prior to this date, I'm gonna throw a date out later, but prior to this event, people lived in small communities. They lived in a community of 150, maybe 200, was pretty big at the time. But this small community was very mobile, and they moved quite a bit, taking advantage of the gifts of nature, taking advantage of fish spawn, taking advantage of ripening of berries, taking advantage of blossoms, nuts that appear, and because they were taking advantage of those things, they occurred in different places, so the people had to be fairly mobile. And so they moved their community fairly often because the new food that was coming up required you to go over there and get it, right? And so you might imagine at this time there were lots and lots of these small communities moving about in western New York and through Ontario County. And they might be moving to the maple sugar bush in the spring. Right now, people would have been coming back from the passenger pigeon hunt, which would have taken place just after maple sugar season. Now is looking towards the planting season, right? But back then, they weren't doing that. They weren't planting. But what they were doing is preparing areas for the promotion of certain plants that would help and encourage them to grow plenty, grow bigger, grow in more quantities, right? And so something happens and radically changes this way of living, which is highly mobile, moving around your territory. So what actually happens? And it happens around 2,000 years ago, actually. This, you might say, a miracle happens, and the people were given a gift. Do you know what that gift was? People like to eat it with butter. Yes. Corn. Corn comes from Central America. Native women, agriculturists, horticulturalists, develop corn from a grass. They transform a grain, they turn the grass seed into a grain. And over many, many, decades, by selecting the seed and planting them and doing all that hard work to cultivate a new variety of vegetable, they wind up with corn. And when corn is invented by human hands, by women's hands, it spreads. The seed spreads because it does a lot of things for you. First of all, corn is incredibly resilient. Corn can be grown in many different climates and many different soil qualities. And you can transform the corn that you have to suit your environment simply by saving some of the seed of the plant at the end of the year, the best stuff, and replanting it the next year. And over time, maybe 2-3 generations, you start to develop corn that is designed for your climate, your time of growing, whatever, 100 days, 120 days. It's designed for you. And so when it arrives up in the Northeast eventually, long after it was invented, took thousands of years, but about 2,000 years ago is the very first evidence of corn archaeologically within the boundaries of what we would call Iroquois, or the Iroquois territories. And it comes by the water, probably up the Mississippi, into the Great Lakes and over. And this is sort of new science, actually, because archaeology has developed to the point where they can actually take soil and do what they call a flotation test and pull out the pollen of plants from a certain level of ground, of depth in the ground. And when they pull the pollen up, they can identify it under a microscope, and they start to identify corn about 2,000 years ago from that evidence. Incredible stuff, very recent, within the last 10 years. And so what happens to the Haudenosaunee people, the Seneca people, right, westernmost nation, is when they get this seed, they start to incorporate it into their daily lives. Well, they don't immediately start to grow, vast fields of corn. They start to incorporate it into their everyday life and plant it in small amounts probably, and still move around and come back in the fall when that plant is ready, right? But over time, rapidly, it might take even another millennia, it totally changes the way people live. And from a highly mobile, small community, now you have large communities that stay in one town for the year, and for many years over time in one place, because the corn is now satisfying all of your, dietary need, your caloric need for what you do as a person to stay alive. The corn is now there for you. And you can grow such a quantity that you can dry it and save it, and you can eat that corn all winter long, and it'll get you through an entire year, into the summer almost, year-round. So once you plant in the springtime, anybody plant here? Anybody put any food in the ground? Any seeds in the ground? Some of you. Do you put vegetables in the ground or just flowers and stuff? Vegetables? How do you gauge your time to plant? Okay, good one. Okay, is that a rule that you made or you learned it? Your dad? Well, I'll tell you the Seneca way. The Seneca, it's kind of funny. The old Seneca people will say that the time to plant corn is when you can walk out in the middle of your field, drop your pants and sit down and withstand it. If it's too cold, you gotta wait. But so that's what happens, is it transforms the way people live. Whereas before you were spending a lot of time traveling, a lot of time building houses, temporary houses, a lot of time taking them apart, moving, all this kind of, it takes time and energy, right? And so when corn arrives, like I described, over that about a millennium it takes for people to completely change the way they live and grow their food in one spot. In concert with the corn, they had already known about squashes and had been cultivating wild squashes and eating squashes. But when corn arrives, then they start to see like, well, we should probably plant these squash seeds where we plant the corn, and let's do that, and they start doing that. And then about 800 years ago or 1,000 years ago, beans arrives in the Haudenosaunee lands, and beans become the third of the primary foods that the people eat: corn, beans, and squash. And at that point, when you're growing those three main vegetables, and in addition, all kinds of other vegetables, cucumbers, watermelons, Jerusalem's artichoke, all kinds of things people were growing. You're living in one town, you're living there for year-round, you're still hunting, you're still fishing, you're still trapping, you're still doing those activities, and you're still collecting wild foods, but more in your area now, not like where you have to go far away to get it. And so this is the point around 1,000 years ago when Seneca people become themselves, and that corn transformed the people's lifestyle, transformed the culture. It precipitated the building of big, long houses where big families could live in and stay there, imagining like the old days, old farm families with everybody working on the farm and all the siblings working together. That's the same kind of thing that was going on in the Seneca communities. And so by the time Ganondagan becomes settled around the 1670s, right, they had been doing that for nearly 7 centuries. And so the community of Ganondagan represents really the most modern Seneca community that Victor understands, or Victor knows about, because of course the people had to leave in 1687. So any questions about that whole story? Yeah, any of the things I've said. Sure. I'll get to that when I get to the, like, what we are today at Ganondagan. I just want to clear up any of the history for you. Yes, sir. Good. It's a good question. Seneca is it's an Anglicization. I'm not sure how you say that word. It's an English way of speaking a Dutch word, and the word the Dutch people use, Seneca, was a bad pronunciation of another language way up in the Northeast, probably the Beothuk people. So it started there, the Beothuks, way up in the far Northeast, were talking about Southerners when they talked to the Dutch sailors, and earlier even the Basque fishermen. And the word got into the French language. They developed a term called Iroquois, right? And then the Dutch in Albany learned these terms, and they started saying Seneker, meaning the Westerners. Has nothing to do with anything, but the Americans started saying Seneca. They didn't want to, they're not speaking Dutch, so they said Seneca, and that's what we're left with today. Of course, Seneca people don't call themselves, well, they do sometimes, but the real word they use is Onondaga, and it means the people of the Great Hill, and which is that hill on the south end of Canandaigua Lake. But that's kind of the history of the name. It's all these mispronunciations, over time. Yeah. No. Oh, Ganondagan, probably they started building in the middle of the 17th century. We're not sure how early. Some people propose 1655. Other people say 1670. We don't know when they started to build. But what happens when a community of the 17th century moves, it's not like everybody gets up one day, okay, it's Saturday, it's time to move, we all move over to a new town. It wasn't like that. Some families would move over, they start to prepare the area for settlement, they start cutting trees, clearing areas for land, for planting, doing all that work, and eventually, slowly, people move over a period of years. It could take even a decade for everybody to get to the new spot. But for sure, by about 1670, 1675, that town was fully populated. There were, hundreds of bark longhouses. Wentworth Greenhall says 150, and 3,000 people or more, depending. But by 1670, that's the size of the town. But earlier, it was probably much smaller and grew as people began to move from the older town, which is over south of here. That makes sense? Yeah. But because of the lithic history, we know that native people have been living in this area for thousands of years, literally. 5,000, 7,000 years, something like that. We know that. But as I described, there was that change where people became culturally distinct, and that took place about 1,000 years ago. Well, I think when we're talking about that kind of vast history, right, we're talking ancient, this is like a long time ago. So that we know that there was glaciers here, and there was a glacial maximum, and as the glacier recedes, then you start to see evidence of humans, right, on the land. And how long ago was that, 12,000 years ago or so, right? Now, were people here on the land? No, it was covered by a glacier. So if there were people around, they were on top of the glacier. And that's probably where they were. But how long ago they arrived, we can't say, I can't say. But if you ask a traditional Seneca person, they will just simply say, we've always been here. And their perception is accurate. As long as they've been Seneca, they've been here. You see? So, when we talk about the theories of, human movement into North America, it's an unanswered question to me. But right now, people will say about 25,000 years ago in the Northeast. This is according to an archaeologist I trust very, very much, James Adovizio. And he says he discovered the very earliest evidence of a community, of a place where people were living 18,000 years ago, called the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. And what does all this mean? You know, as long as there was land here, we were here. That's as much as I can tell you, you know. Genetically, I can also tell you, because I've done my genetic profile, that I have ancient ancestral links to Siberia, to, you know, the Pacific Islands. I'm a direct ancestor of the Kennewick man, personally, who has, you know, been around a long time. But none of that really matters to me, actually. I know that we've been here as long as there was land exposed, you know. So as early as the land appeared and was able to be lived on by people, humans have been here, and the northeastern people have been here. So you might say, like, as early as the turtle exposed its back, or the land emerged from within the sea or the ice, people were here. Yeah. Any questions before we move on? Yeah.
Michael,
Right. And so, okay, that's the second part of the story. So when you had small communities moving around quite a bit, you relied heavily on men to produce during the hunt. This was an important aspect to your life. That's what you needed. And so a lot of the leadership ended up really falling in the men's hands to protect one another, to protect your community, to hunt, to fish, to do all these activities, which falls to the men, right? But when agriculture and corn and squash and beans becomes the new priority and the new economy, something changes in your leadership structure as well. And what happens is, we say that there was a law that was developed called the Great Law of Peace, the Ganondagan, and it was brought around at a time when people were fighting and they couldn't see eye to eye, they really couldn't resolve their differences, and this law united the people. But it also established that women would be the leaders of their families, not the men. They would be the clan mothers. And from their lineage, they would select male leaders who would be attached to the clan mother. So for like each male leader, they call Hoyane, will have a clan mother associated with him, and she advises him. He can speak for her and her clan what she has told him to say, basically, and debate and deliberate and make decisions about what would affect your nation, and then also in a federal system, what would affect every of those nations, the Senecas, the Cayugas, Onondagas, Oneidas, Mohawks, and later Tuscaroras, you know. So there's a shift in leadership structure because women now really are responsible for the majority of the food economy of the communities. It's all in their hands. And so, and you're also living together in one house, right? I'll describe how a Seneca man gets married. His mother gives him his clan identity, right? The Senecas have 8: turtle, wolf, beaver, bear, heron, hawk, snipe, and deer. You get your clan from your mother, so as a man, you inherit your mother's clan. You grow up in your house where your mother is and her sisters and your cousins and whatnot. And when you go to get married, you have to marry somebody outside of your clan because your clan is considered your family regardless of whether or not you can trace a bloodline. And so you marry somebody else. If that other family agrees and you get married, husband moves in with the wife in her house where she's in charge. Her mom is in charge. Her aunt is in charge. and you're a guest in a lot of ways. So you have to toe the line, so to speak, right? And be able to function in there. So it's really the women who become counselors and the ones who are settling arguments and debates and problems in the house, because you're there now. You're no longer traveling and moving around and living in smaller houses, literally. You now have to all live together year round. And so you have this other change going on where, you're moving in with your wife's family and her house. And the old tradition is that if that household you may come back and find your belongings on the outside of the longhouse, and that is a sign that you're no longer welcome. Divorce was simple. There was no litigation. If the women were like, he's done, there's no question. You go back and live with your mom. Yeah. So any other, yes? Nope, hangs on to his clan. He's always part of that clan. Yeah, his wife, he marries her, but the children don't inherit his clan. Right. And if they're from separate nations, they inherit her nation too. Her citizenship, it flows through the matrilineal line. Yeah. There was a lot of changes, differences. At the time, they developed a system where women were the owners of the house, the household, and the belonging, all the things that make a house work. In other words, all the tools and equipment that you need to prepare meals and to do anything you need. It's all run by the women. The land that the town is in, that's really managed by the women. The fields that are cleared for growing food, that's all managed by the women. You could say it was it's not really property, but it's under women's management. So that is kind of a property in a way. And men dealt with things that were external. So they were delegates, diplomats, warriors, that doing things away from the community, right? That was more or less considered the men's responsibility. So you there were some changes that took place culturally in order for it all to work. And it worked for a long, long, long time until the Europeans arrive. Yeah. Any other questions about that? So Ganondagan, the name Ganondagan is Seneca for a town on a hill that's surrounded by something white, like a whitish cast. And Seneca people say that white was a blossom that emerged in the springtime, and when it turned into a fruit, the people ate it. We don't know. Was it a strawberry in the fields, strawberry blossoms? Was it black cherries? Was it June berries? We don't know. But they say it's a white blossom, and it surrounded the hill, and the town was on top. That's what it means, yeah. So any of the Seneca words or Iroquoian words that have onunda in it means a hill. Anything with onunda. So Ganonda, right? That refers to a town on a hill. Onondaga is the people of the hills. Yeah. So people start to build, like I described, sometime in the middle of the 17th century. Over time, they built close to 150 or more houses. At the time, they're just called houses. Today, people call them longhouses, but the word in Seneca just means a house. Just happens to be long, right? So today they say longhouse, but they built homes, cabins, or whatnot. They built them out of wood. A lot of times it was cedar, sometimes hickory. They built the frames out of, and then covered it in bark. And the bark was elm in a lot of cases, but you could use other trees. Tulip poplar works too, even ash. But mostly it was elm bark. And the community was probably around, between 3,000-4,000 people when everybody was home at one time. The majority, obviously, were children and women. There were 4 main Seneca towns at the same time that Ganondagan was being lived in. 2 big towns, you might say. One is Todiacton, which is, what are my directions here, west of us, and then two smaller satellite towns. But those, when I say small, it's like 2,000 people in those small towns. Todiacton had slightly less than Ganondagan, maybe 125 houses, something like that. Todiacton is actually the way we say it today, but it's really Jodihekton, and it means the bend in the, there's a bend in the creek or stream or something. And so this pattern, you have kind of a western and an eastern branch then, two big towns, more or less parallel along the east-west axis, and then two smaller below. You sort of have a western branch and an eastern branch of the Seneca people. And this pattern had been going on for hundreds of years. They call it the Ganarka Creek town pattern that occurred from the 1500s into the late 1600s. And when people selected the hilltop here, which people call the Boughton Hill, it was selected for a lot of reasons, but probably the most important is that it had great water. The hill is a flat-topped hill, mostly sandy. So rain comes down, and it filters, that sand kind of filters the water. And on the sides of the hill were these springs, and some still exist. And these springs produced clean, fresh water for the community. And then also, of course, being next to the Great Brook, which was bigger at the time, you had lots of land which was flooded, floodplain they call it. And so you have this beautifully fertile, silty soil to grow your food on. And that was where people grew their corn. They didn't plow, they didn't turn the soil, because that silty soil was already very rich, and all you had to do was just scrape it up into a mound, actually. In the 1740s, a naturalist, a Swedish botanist, came through, and when he was recording the soil qualities of what we say is Iroquois, he said that there were sometimes 30-inch deep topsoil where the Senecas were growing. That's incredible, But when you think about it being silty and constantly being created every year by the spring floods, it makes a lot of sense. And the Senecas knew that, and that's where they grew. Of course, they could grow anywhere they wanted. All around us, if you look at the soil survey maps, all around the hilltop is actually what they call alpha sols, so excellent growing lands. And so we know that they were probably had a lot of acreage under cultivation. They were growing millions of bushels of corn a year. We know this because I did a lot of work with Cornell, and the two different people there. One is Jane Mount Pleasant, who is a botanist, and she sort of dedicated her life to learning about Iroquois corn. And the other was like a sort of a general archaeologist, Kurt Jordan. And with those two people, we worked up some statistics about population of the town. Jane had a formula for caloric need based on corn, how much calories you would need at the time, how much corn yield per acre white corn would produce. And so we started to develop, ideas about how much acreage would be required to produce the minimum corn requirement for that town, knowing that they had extra, that they always had to grow extra. We also then knew kind of what kind of acreage was required, and we even knew we started to learn even from charcoal samples what kinds of trees were around, what were they using to burn firewood, and all this stuff has been part of our understandings over time, what was going on at Ganondagan. So that's kind of what happened at Ganondagan. The reason people left, very simply put, there was a French invasion. The French intended on, competing for the continent, right, in a contest with the English. They were in competition. They were looking for economic advantage. North America represented for them incredible economic opportunity, lots of resources, natural resources, which could be exploited and extracted to produce wealth in Europe. And they fought with the English, they fought with the Dutch, the French fought with everybody, the English fought with everybody. And in the late 17th century, the Seneca people were interfering in that economy. The French were really invested in the fur trade. They wanted beaver furs among many other fur-bearing animals, but beaver was the number one. And they were out in the Great Lakes, in the western Great Lakes, all the way out past Detroit, out to Michilimackinac, and they were bringing furs back through the Great Lakes at the time, and they passed through Seneca territory, which was under Seneca control at the mouth of the Niagara. And so the Seneca saw no reason why they couldn't just take those canoes of furs whenever they found them, because the French had no agreement to trespass, no agreement to move goods through their territory. And so Seneca people saw no reason why they shouldn't take those furs, because they were illegally being transported through their land. And so it became such a problem that it got back to the king at Versailles, Louis XIV, who decided that he would, with his advisors, a man named Colbert and others, that they would wage war on the Iroquois and, in their words, humble them. And their intent was to just get rid of the Senecas who controlled that waterway. And so he sent armies to every nation of the Confederacy over a period of time, from the 1660s to the 1690s. The plan was really a threefold attack, and the intent originally by the architects of this war was to do it all at once. But you have a problem in the 17th century, and that is you have to move your army through a vast wilderness. Up in Montreal, between Montreal and here, I mean, you can go by water, but you still have to get out of your boat to get to the Seneca communities, and so, or the Onondaga communities, or the Mohawk communities, whatever. And so they decided to break it up into 3 different invasions over time, and that was a terrible idea. If you were a strategist, it was horrible. But the piece that came down here to Ganondagan in 1687 was an army that was made up of a number of, you could say, 3 different types of troops. You had French soldiers, professional soldiers, who had never been to North America, right? These are soldiers from European battle theaters, not the woods and the waters of North America. Then you had militia, and French militiamen was simply anybody who lived in the colony, who between the age of 16 and 60, you were in the militia. And you had to drill every month. You had to have a functional weapon that had to be inspected every month. And didn't matter if you were a baker or a sheep herder or whatever, you were in the militia. And so a third of the army was these militiamen who are not trained soldiers. There's regular people who are, have to go out every month and do maneuvers in some fort and learn how to wheel right and wheel left and march and all that stuff. And then the third component was native allies, who the French had made alliances with. Many allies, actually. They had lots of, the Iroquois people had lots of enemies, actually, who wanted to, have what the Iroquois people had. And so they were the third component. And that army came down from Rundequoit Bay in July of 1687, and with the intent of destroying the Seneca Nation. So they marched into the heartland, the largest community, the second largest community, the 2 smaller communities, and really lots of other smaller ones, which were more like 500 people, and they invaded. But what happened was the Seneca people just simply left. They knew what was going on. They actually had advanced knowledge. They had been there in Montreal earlier in the year, in the spring, and one Seneca man said, "I saw rooms full of Indian shoes, being stored there. So why are they, Indian shoes are, the French were making French versions of Indian moccasins, and so why would they make all these moccasins, right? And he said, I saw rooms full of Indian shoes being produced. And another one said, I noticed that their bake ovens were running day and night. So bake ovens usually run when? In the night. They run in the, bakers get up real early, so it's kind of the night, but into the morning, yeah. But if you run them twice, that means you're overproducing the amount of bread that you actually need. And so what was that going to? That was being produced for rations for these soldiers to carry with them. And the shoes were what was being issued to their soldiers and their militia to walk in. It was much better than the French heeled shoes in the woods. It's just, they didn't work really good. It's like wearing slick cowboy boots, in mud, in slick mud in the woods. It just doesn't work good. So anyways, that was their knowledge. They knew that in the spring of 1687, came back and said, hey, something's going on. We got to get ready. And so actually the Senecas knew that something was happening. They didn't know where they were going to attack. But when they got to the Irondequoit Bay, they had people there watching. And those young men ran back and told everyone. They had 2 weeks' notice almost, 10 days, we'll say. 2 business weeks. They had 10 days notice, and what the Seneca people did was they left behind some people. They attacked the army as it came down south, and then disappeared, burnt their houses to the ground, and left. And that's what happened at the other towns. It was really a failure. The French invasion was a failure. But what they did do was destroy the corn. And that was, it's a kind of an unethical sort of war tactic to destroy a people's food. You're not really fighting soldier to soldier. You're fighting the people and the children and the grandmas, putting them to suffer. But they did it, and the Senecas found that they got help from the Cayugas and Onondagas, and that's where they went. They kind of housed them and took care of them during the winter. And the next years they went and built more towards Geneva, a place called White Springs near there. But that's the nutshell history of Ganondagan. How long did I have? We're over. So I'll just tell you right now a couple things about what we are today. So Ganondagan right now is around, almost 600 acres of protected lands. We have walking trails over that land. We have a large interpretive center and museum. We have a Friends of Ganondagan organization. So the Friends of Ganondagan help us to do programming, so holding events like our big summer festival or whatever. We have cooking events, storytelling, dance events, art shows, just all kinds of things going on at Ganondagan. And the Friends help with that. They also manage the Iroquois White Corn Project, which is more or less, it's a project designed to provide Iroquois white corn to people today so that you can use it in your everyday meal and relieve you of the burden of having to process that white corn. So processing the white corn requires boiling it with hardwood ashes, 3 hours, 4 hours, and then cleaning it, sifting it, washing it, sorting it, and then you can use it. So it's a whole day's worth of labor to use it, but the White Corn Project does that for you and then dehydrates the corn, so all you got to do is rehydrate it. Like if you bought, like dry beans. You buy dry beans, you got to soak them, and then you can use them. It's the same thing. So what we do in my house is we throw it in a pressure cooker, like what's that pressure cooker called? The hot pot. Is that what it is? Instapot. We use the Instapot. That's what we do. And we used to use a crock pot. We use the Instapot now, and you could use it right away. So that's kind of what they do. They sell their product in the gift shop, or you could just stop down and ask about it, and we can get you some. They produce the whole kernel corn, which is more like a hominy, and you might eat that in a corn soup or a stew. I put it in chili. It's great. They also produce flour. So they have a white flour, and then they have a roasted flour. They have an old-fashioned coffee roaster that they roast the corn in, and then they grind it in the mill, and you get this nice roasted flavor in the corn. So there's 3 products. Yeah, so that is all the time I have. I don't want to. I don't want to tip my hat, right? I don't want to tell you what I'm going to do. I want it to be a kind of more of a surprise, and as we get toward, because I'm not going to do anything until 26. So people are doing things now, and there's anniversary moments now, but I'm not going to deal with them. I'll tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not interested in troop numbers. I'm not interested in what type of button a certain regiment had. I'm not interested in the kind of guns they had. I'm not interested in war, to be honest. I'm not going to talk about battles, because no battles took place at Ganondagan or even in this community. I'm not going to talk about Sullivan and Clinton specifically, although we have a project that is going to implicate the Sullivan and Clinton invasion of 1779. That won't happen until 2027. But I have a plan, and it's organized. I will share with you one plan I have on how we're going to interpret it. I'm working with some German museums right now to bring a collection of American Revolutionary War objects that were brought back by German soldiers and officers, Hessians, and are in German museums. These objects are not related to warfare. They're really more objects of art. And so it's more the exhibition, even though the objects came from the period of the American Revolutionary time, they're not war related. But they are going to reflect on what people were doing at the time, like what kind of art were they producing, what did people wear, those kinds of things. And it'll be an exceptional exhibition of very rare objects, actually, coming back to the United States. And I think you should look forward to that. But we won't announce the things that we're doing until we get to the point where we are going to be sort of like raising money for it. Like, so this is the project, this is our need, and we're going to go after grant monies and things and private donations to make these things happen. But I don't want to tell you right now everything. But it's going to be cool, trust me. You will love it, actually. Very interesting projects. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. That's right. Yep. When it comes to these stories of like over 1,000 years ago, it's so hard to kind of give you a specific date, and I don't really care. I just know it happened a long time ago, and putting a date to it is a little challenging. It's kind of like, I don't know. It's a challenge because then people maybe want to refute it. You know what I mean? Like, oh, that didn't happen in that year. It was definitely a good thing, and ultimately a good thing for the Americans, because the model of the Iroquois Confederacy's governmental form was and did have an impact on the early founders of the United States. They used information from many different peoples, including the Greeks, to create what is the American Republic, Democratic Republic. Yeah. And the Confederacy played a role in that. And so in a lot of ways, the United States was implicated in that story too. Well, I thank you all for your time, and I encourage you to come and see us at Ganondagan. Currently, we have an exhibition of modern art. We call it 6 Haudenosaunee painters. It's very contemporary art produced by Haudenosaunee women. I love it. I think it's great. I'm an art lover. Yeah, come and see us. When it's warmer out even, and when we put the longhouse up in May. We're open year-round. We're open to the public Wednesday through Saturday. Yeah. Of course, the grounds are open dawn to dusk every day. Yeah. All right, you're welcome. Thank you all.